20 months ago, President Cyril Ramaphosa stood in front of Parliament promising great change using words like watch the space, creating anticipation and expectations. 20 months later, has South Africa materially changed to warrant an investment sentiment? David Pilling, editor of the FT Africa, joins me now for more. David, thank you very much for your time. The president started 20 months ago on a quarter term, I guess, that he was finishing off Jacob Zuma, speaking about dealing with the energy utility Eskom. Today, Eskom hangs as an albatross around his neck. Has the president's messaging changed essentially 20 months later?
Well, in the conference that he just was at, the Financial Times in London, he specifically addressed Eskom. He certainly didn't hide, behind the issue. He said that Eskom was in dire straits. He talked about contingent liabilities around South African debt. And clearly he was talking largely about Eskom, although, he was talking about some of the other SOEs as well, including South African Airways. What he said was that there would be announcements in the next few days. Now, I can't tell you whether those announcements will happen or whether they'll satisfy people. He said that the announcements would make it clearer how they were going to deal with Eskom's debt. They would make it clearer how they were going to collect tariffs for electricity. And he said that a lot of electricity was being stolen. He also said that a new management team, a new executive would be put in place, and that the likes of Moody's, and Moody's obviously is the one international ratings agency that has not yet downgraded South African debt. He said that they would be pleased by the announcement. Now, it's true these are words. You're much closer to this than I am, but those were his words.
Something that I am much closer to, David, and this is the little discrepancy of the president speaking to a highly sought after business investor community at your event, at the FT event on Monday, and promising that there will be an announcement on the Eskom debt. Fast forward 2 days, David, just 2 days. Eskom has beat him to the punch and they've made their own announcement. The rolling blackouts are back in fashion and they may be here for the next week or so. When you hear something like that, and I want you to tell me about at least the perception of the audience, does it seem like Cyril Ramaphosa is in charge?
Well, look, clearly Eskom's in huge problems. The fact that it has blackouts, I think, is a manifestation of that. And clearly it's not the first time that there've been blackouts. Is Cyril Ramaphosa in charge? I think he's at the head of a very divided party. He won the presidency of the ANC by a smidgen, as you know. It's a party that that many people think became hugely corrupted under Jacob Zuma and over a 9-10 year period. And with the best will in the world, even if you thought that Cyril Ramaphosa walked on water, which I presume very few people do believe, but if you believe that, it's a tough task. No one would doubt that you can't just reform the ANC overnight. So clearly he's fighting all sorts of internal battles. And those battles will be for turf and for territory and for resources. They're presumably also ideological battles. There are hugely different opinions about what you do with Eskom. I'm sure if you put Tito Mboweni in charge of Eskom or Pravin Gordhan in charge of Eskom, you'd come out with a slightly or even a very different solution. And these battles are being fought behind the scenes, maybe to some extent in public, in South Africa. Does that mean that Cyril Ramaphosa's in charge or not in charge? It means that he runs a divided party that doesn't yet speak with one voice and maybe doesn't yet all pull together.
Staying with the electricity utility Eskom, and this is my final question on that. The president seems to be telling investors that Eskom will be dealt with. But Eskom has been, as one investor once said to me, Karabo, uncertainty is worse than volatility. With Eskom, we really don't know the price of electricity. As we speak, they are planning on taking the regulator to court, asking for better, more favorable tariffs. Business cannot make its own cost production because they really have no way of a predictable cost curve for the price of electricity production. Yeah. So my question is, if any money is looking for growth, surely they have to want the basis of a reliable energy supply before they put their money there. How important is a reliable energy supply to most of the members that were in the audience on Monday, and what do they say about this albatross that is Eskom?
I mean, it's hugely important if you're going to invest in South Africa. You want to know, as far as electricity and power is concerned, you want to know two things. You want to know, will the electricity be reliable, or will I be subject to blackouts? And what is the cost of that electricity? A third question would be, is that electricity going to be at a competitive cost? You could announce a cost in advance that was uncompetitive, and that would be off-putting. So I think you're quite right. Transparency over these would be very important for investors. And after all, South Africa is a sophisticated economy. If we're talking about manufacturing, I mean, there may be other sectors, tourism or insurance or whatever, that don't rely so much on electricity as an input. But anything that does, then clearly this is hugely important. I mean, Eskom also stands for something else, doesn't it? It stands for a deterioration in the way that that South Africa was run. It stands for a much worsened fiscal position, and the fiscal constraints that the government now has to deal with, both in trying to revive an economy that's been basically stalled for years and years and years, when what you should be having is really very fast growth, because you need that growth in order to redistribute it. You just don't have that at the moment.
And that's the problem. You're right about one thing. Eskom is the epitome of what has gone wrong with South Africa. It's literally where money seems to have walked out of the state utility. And we're talking to the tunes of billions. And that was the big headline from the FT Africa Summit event on Monday, that President Cyril Ramaphosa estimates that between R500 billion and R1 trillion could have been looted. My thing is that he seemed that, from the messaging at least that he was giving investors, he seems convinced that the prosecuting authority is well on track and we will see prosecutions. Is anyone else convinced of his message? Considering if R1 trillion was stolen, surely someone, at least one person, should be behind bars. We have zero as we stand.
No, but we've seen, for example, the Americans impose sanctions on the Guptas. The Guptas have clearly been kind of flushed out. He did mention the prosecuting authority. He said that this was one of the institutions that had been hollowed out under Jacob Zuma. He also mentioned the revenue services. And he said that these were well on the way to being repaired. Again, these are words. You will be able to judge much more closely than I. I mean, clearly there have been changes of personnel. But he seems convinced that the tax authority, for example, will reverse what has been a decline in tax revenue. And I think I'm right in saying that some officials around him are saying that by next year you'll be kind of back up to where it was and even improving. Now time will tell. And on the prosecuting authority, the same. He says that the institution is being repaired, and he clearly trusts it. I would almost say more than that. I would say that he's relying on it, because some of these internal divisions within the ANC are highly toxic politically. He's probably not going to take those on himself. He would much prefer a prosecuting authority to take people out who he considers enemies, or who he considers had been corrupted under the previous administration. So in other words, I think it's part of what he wants. And now whether he can get what he wants, of course, is a different matter.
David, you are being too kind. I know you followed the Africa Rising story for decades. Now, my final question is, South Africa stands as rated as investment grade by only one of the big three ratings agency. Yeah. Come the end of October, Moody's is coming to town, and that may not necessarily be a good tune, depending on the kind of ratings decision they give us. I'm going to put you in a corner here. Do they kick the can down the road, or do they not have an option this time, considering the rolling blackouts that we've just started this week?
I don't think the rolling blackouts, I mean, as bad and difficult they are as they are for ordinary South Africans, will be the prime sort of influencer on its decision. I think they're going to take a hard look at the books. They're going to look at the budget. I think you have a mini budget coming up. They're going to look at the numbers. Look, Moody's has been the one holdout. I can't quite tell you why Moody's has had more confidence, or at least less disconfidence in South Africa than the other two big ratings agencies. But clearly it has kind of held the line. If you put me on the spot and ask me, my guess is yes, it will hold the line again and won't downgrade. But who knows?
Thanks to my guest, David Pilling, editor of the FT Africa.